Good morning everyone. Today I'm going to show you how to bake some biscuits. Biscuits are a really easy thing to be able to cook during lockdown because you really don't need many ingredients at all. You don't need any eggs. Eggs are quite hard to get hold of at the moment. And actually you can make a really small batch so you're not using up too much of the ingredients that you need at this difficult time. Today I'm going to be making some chocolate biscuits. However, you don't need to have the cocoa in your mix to turn them chocolatey. You can just have shortbread biscuits, which are very buttery. So today's objectives to make your biscuits. 1, you're learning the process of rubbing. Rubbing is where you rub butter and flour together. What that does is it combines the two ingredients. Those two ingredients, when you're rubbing, will start to look like breadcrumbs. I know that sounds silly, but they will start to look like breadcrumbs. When they do, you know your rubbing in process is good. So that's the first objective. The second objective is baking times. You need to keep checking your biscuits to make sure that they are baked, but you don't want to keep opening the oven. If you open the oven, all the heat escapes, and that's going to affect your cooking times. Another thing in regards to baking time is that you need your biscuits the same size. If they're not the same size, you've got little ones and big ones on the same baking tray, the little ones will cook really quickly and start to burn by the time the big ones are not cooked and still raw. And the third objective today is looking at aesthetics again. So we want to make sure your biscuits look nice, they can look even. You can use cookie cutters if you want to add a bit of fun to the biscuit idea. But if you haven't got any cookie cutters, don't worry, you can just shape them by hand into round, square, oval shapes, whatever you would decide, but you need to make sure they're the same size and they look identical. Another thing we're going to add in is I'm going to show you how to cut up some normal chocolate that you can add in for chocolate chunks if you would like to. You don't have to buy chocolate drops from the shop. You can just have a bar of chocolate. I'm going to show you a few knife skills, the safe way of cutting your chocolate so you can add that into your mixture. So they're the objectives. I'm going to show you step-by-step guide of how to make these biscuits, including the baking process and what you're checking for when they're cooked. Here we go. So first thing you need to do is make sure that you've cleaned all of your work surfaces. And as you can see on mine, I've given it a good antibacterial wipe. If you haven't got antibacterial wipes, don't worry. A bit of washing up liquid and soapy water will do just the same job and make sure everything's nice and clean, ready for your baking. You do not want any cross-contamination, so make sure all your surfaces are really nice and clean. Most importantly, first things first, wash hands. Make sure you've got some antibacterial hand wash. Give them a good scrub. 20 seconds is the advice in lockdown at the moment. I would recommend slightly longer because you're going to be handling the food, so you need to give it a good old hand wash. Make sure you use hot water. So as I said, first job you need to do is make sure you have washed your hands thoroughly. Get your hands wet first, and then you open your hands up ready for a good squirt of soap. Scrub all of the soap together in your hands. Make sure you get all your fingers in all the gaps, just like the demonstration here. Make sure you scrub those thumbs. Make sure you're scrubbing on the back of your hands. You need to do it at least 20 seconds or so, and then when you're happy, turn the tap back on and then rinse off that soap, ready to nice and clean. At this point, you don't want to be touching your hair, your face, any part that might spread some germs. That's really crucial, especially at this difficult time. Equipment needed. So I've got a sharp knife and a white chopping board. I'll let you keep thinking as to why you might need that for biscuits in a second, and I'll tell you the answers. Mixing spoon. Doesn't matter whether it's stainless steel or whether it's wood. Any big spoon's good. Baking tray. My baking tray's got holes in, and what that allows is when your biscuits are in the oven, the heat rises up from the bottom. It just cooks the underside of your biscuit really nicely. If you haven't got a baking tray with holes in, it's no problem. You might just need to increase the cooking time by maybe a minute or so. Fish slice, which we use to scrape off our biscuits from our baking tray and place onto our cooling rack. It's really important that you have something to cool your biscuits on, because biscuits, when they come out the oven, will still be soft, even though they're cooked. as the biscuits cool, they harden. So you need to have something to cool them on. If you haven't got a cooling rack, don't worry. Make sure you just take it off the baking tray and maybe place on a plate or something clean that you can leave them for, because the baking tray is going to retain quite a lot of heat for quite a while. So you need to make sure you take it off the hot baking tray and onto a cooling rack or alternative. And we've got the essential oven timer, which is really, really important. More equipment you need, big mixing bowl. Okay, it doesn't matter whether you've got a plastic mixing bowl or whether you've got a stainless steel one, you just need a big mixing bowl, and you obviously need some scales to weigh out your ingredients. So ingredients, I've got a bar of chocolate here. It's just dark chocolate chunks that you can see. These chunks are obviously going to be way too big, but as I said earlier, you can chop them up using your white chopping board and sharp knife. The reason why it's a white chopping board, if you haven't got a white one, don't worry, but officially a white one is for dairy products, and because of the milk in the chocolate, it needs to be on a white chopping board if you've got one. If you haven't, don't worry, as long as you're using something, it's best not to be chopping things on the work surface because it can mark. I've got 2 types of butter here. You don't need 2 types of butter. This is full fat butter, unsalted. Okay, this is quite expensive at the moment. If you can't afford that, do not worry. This is about £1.50 for a block of 250 grams of butter. If you do have butter and you do want to use it, keep it out the fridge for 5 to 10 minutes before you use it. It just makes it that little bit softer and much easier to use when you're going to be rubbing it into your bowl. If you haven't got butter or it's too expensive, spread will do. It works just in the same way. The only difference between the two is that if you're using butter, your biscuits will be a little bit more crumblier, okay, than they will do with the spread. But spread's cheap, saves a lot of money, and is just as good. If you don't have cocoa, don't worry. I've got some cocoa because we're going to make chocolate biscuits. If you don't have cocoa, you don't need to add it. Your biscuits will just be like shortbread. Caster sugar. Now I'm using caster sugar rather than granulated sugar. Sugar is sugar. It doesn't matter whether you use caster or granulated. The only difference is that caster sugar is ground down into finer grains. The actual grains of sugar are a lot finer than they are in granulated, so they're good for baking because you don't get that same crunch that you might do from the granulated sugar. And then the last bit, plain flour. If you've got self-raising, that's okay, but ideally you want plain flour. You don't really want your biscuits to rise like you do in a cake. Otherwise, when you put them on your baking tray, one biscuit might merge into another. So plain flour ideally, but if you don't have any, use self-raising. The only difference between plain flour and self-raising is that self-raising's got baking powder in a little bit, so that it makes your biscuits or your cakes or whatever you're cooking with it rise and expand in the oven when it's hot. First thing you need to do before anything else is to preheat your oven. So my oven has a gas hob, but the actual oven itself is electric. This one here is a fan-assisted electric oven. And what that means is when I turn the oven on using the dial, you want it at about 180 degrees. And if you do the maths, it's about there. So this is a fan-assisted oven. You can hear the whirring and you can hear the fan. Okay, that fan means that the hot air is going to be blown around the oven. So in theory, all areas of your oven should be cooking at the same temperature because the hot air is moving on the inside of that oven. Okay, sometimes an older cooker, the fan doesn't do its job properly, so the top might be a bit hotter. I would recommend baking your biscuits on the middle shelf because it's much easier to control the temperature at that point. If you've got a gas oven, make sure your flame is at the back of your oven. And just be aware there is no fan in a gas oven, so that it might take a little bit longer for your biscuits to bake. Not a problem, you need to try and decide and determine as to whether your cooker is suitable for these biscuits, which type you would like, electric or gas. But as I said in one of the objectives, it's important for you to make that decision. So, quick take 5 for you. What does baking powder do? number 2, can you explain what yeast does and where it might be used? So as you can see, I've unwrapped the butter, and what is quite good about the packaging is that it has 50 gram markers on. This is a 250 gram block of butter, and what you can do is use your knife to cut along or put a mark along that line, so you know that that is 50 grams worth of butter. And then you can chop up your butter. The first thing you need to do is chop up your butter into small chunks, making sure you've got the right amount. So first thing you need to do is use your sharp knife and your butter on your white chopping board if you've got one. If you haven't, don't panic, because it's a dairy product, and you want to chop your butter that you should have weighed out already using your scales accurately. You want to chop it up into lots and lots of small chunks. So you want to be chopping your butter up into lots of little chunks just like this. The smaller the chunks, the easier this next bit becomes. The first objective was talking about rubbing in. If you've got a big chunk of butter like this, okay, you're not going to be able to break that down very easily when you're rubbing the butter and the flour between your fingers, which is the rubbing process. You want some nice small chunks like that, because it's going to break down a lot easier. Really important, that. Using scales. So if you place your bowl on a set of scales that are at 0, the scales obviously will start to weigh the bowl. What you don't want to do is then start weighing out your ingredients with that, because this is not at 0. To 0 any scales, there will be a tar button on it. Tap the tar button when your bowl is on your scales, just like that, and you can see it goes back to 0. What we can then do is start to weigh out your ingredients. So I'm going to weigh out my flour, pouring it in, keeping an eye on the scale measure. I'm going to aim for about 100 grams. Okay, 100, perfect. It doesn't matter if you go over to 101, 102, 103, or you're under slightly, as long as you're not over massively, like 120, 130 grams. That's a problem. However, just being really close to 100 is good. You can take a bit away if you want, but I wouldn't panic too much. So, the butter chunks have been cut up on the white chopping board for dairy, and then dropped inside your weighed out flour. Rubbing in, the first objective. What you need to do now is get your hands in the bowl, as demonstrated brilliantly by my sous chef Toby, and you need to mix. With your hands, mix, mix, mix. After you've mixed the butter around so that it starts to become covered in your flour, you then need to rub. And what that means is you get some of your butter and your flour in between your thumb and your index finger, and you rub like that. And what that will do is start to combine, key term, combine your flour and your butter together to look like breadcrumbs. And you just keep going until your mixture looks like breadcrumbs. So just a little summary of how we're getting on so far. We've got all of our equipment, we've got all of our ingredients, we're starting to weigh out our ingredients, we've made sure that we've preheated our oven. Another top tip for you is to fill up your washing up bowl with some hot water and some soap, ready to start washing up for your equipment. Keeping everything clean is really, really important so we don't cross-contaminate. Another key term for you, cross-contamination is where 2 ingredients or 2 parts of food or 2 bits of equipment touch and therefore are spreading germs and bacteria, and that's the last thing we want, especially at the moment. So I'm just going to fill up my washing up bowl, ready to put any dirty equipment in there so I can start washing it straight away. So if you find that the butter's not really combining very well with your flour, it probably means that you need a little bit more flour, because the butter might be starting to melt in your hands at this point, so it becomes really sticky. If your mixture is too sticky, add a bit more flour. If your mixture's not sticking together at all and not coming together, you might need a bit more butter. That's down to you to decide. Use your intuition and think as to what you might do. Add flour or butter, and that'll fix your problem. We need a bit more flour. So you might be able to see now, after lots of mixing, how your flour and your butter now looks like breadcrumbs. And when it gets to that sort of stage, that's perfect. You can either now add your cocoa if you're going to make them chocolate biscuits. If you're not going to make them chocolate biscuits, this is where your sugar goes in. So we've added in our cocoa and we've added in our caster sugar, and we've given it a really good mix. What you might find by adding cocoa is, because it's a dry ingredient, it might dry your mixture out a little bit too much. What you're aiming for is when you pick up your mixture and squeeze it in your hand, that it holds together without too much crumbling. But as you can see from that, it's really quite crumbly, okay, because the cocoa has dried out our mixture. So we need a little bit more butter. And referring back to our objective, just like we were saying, it's about you making those decisions as to when you might need to add more ingredients or take ingredients away. But still too crumbly for us because you've added all that cocoa. The sugar's mixed in really nicely now. I'm going to add a bit more butter, and then what you've got to try and do is clump all of your mixture together to turn it into a dough. When it's a dough, you can then start shaping into biscuit shapes. So you don't need chocolate drops. You can make your own chunks of chocolate for your biscuits if you would like. Here's my dark chocolate, okay? I'm gonna break them into 4 chunks wide. But obviously, even these chunks here, they're just too big to put in a biscuit. So this is where your knife skills come in. Claw grip, okay? For those of you who remember, claw grip is where the ends of your fingertips curl over and underneath, so that when you're chopping, the ends of your finger aren't sticking out. So they're just curling under like so. And because chocolate is a hard ingredient, you may need a bit of pressure, which is why claw grip is really, really important. You can then push using your knife into some long strips, like you can see there, okay? Making sure those fingers are curled under. If you want to do a bridge grip, which is this one here, you bridge over the top of your chocolate and you slice that way. Now that you've got long strips, you probably need to cut those in half. And it may be that you don't hold this chocolate at all, because that's going to be really close to the end of your fingertips, and you just lean on the back of the knife here, okay? And by doing that, it breaks up quite easily. And then you can scrape those chocolate chunks into your bowl with your mixture before you clump it into a dough ball, and you'll have some chocolate chunks in your biscuit. Yum. So as you can see, our dough has come together to form a ball. What's really good about this dough is that if there was any crumbs at the bottom of your bowl, you roll the ball at the bottom of your bowl and it will collect all of those crumbs. And if it does that, you know that's the perfect consistency. And you can see some of those crumbs are disappearing because it's sticking to that ball of dough. But what is also good about this dough is that when you roll it in your hands, it's not sticking to your hands. They're the 2 ways of checking the dough is really good. So now what you need to do is roll your dough out, or I prefer just to squash it down. If you squash your dough down, what you're going to be able to do is create a nice shape. You might need a little bit of flour on your table or your work surface to do that, because it's a little sticky and we don't want it sticking to the work surface. So you put it on your work surface just like that, and you pat it down with your hands and squash it down. You can use a rolling pin, but because it's got real butter in, the butter is going to want it to spread apart and split. You can see these cracks appearing. Now they're great for cookies, that's exactly what you want, but if you roll it, you might get lots and lots of cracks and it may start to fall apart. So patting it down with your hands is perfect, just what we need. And then after you've got it to a consistent thickness, and that's the important part, the word there is consistent, that means the same all the way along. So consistency is the important word. You want to try and flatten your dough down. You can see I've got a lot more flour on there now, because as it's a warm day, my warm hands are starting to melt the butter inside the cookies, so they were starting to go really sticky. So I've added a bit more flour. We've got nice consistency, same thickness all the way through, And then at this point, what you can do is two options. Use a cookie cutter. If you don't have cookie cutters, you grab a section of dough, pull it apart, and use your hands to flatten, to pinch the edges, and shape into what would be your biscuit round shape. Okay? And then when you're happy, it goes on your baking tray, like so. I've floured the baking tray. You can flour it, greaseproof paper, but if you haven't got any greaseproof paper, flour is just as good. This is a non-stick baking tray, however, unless it's a really expensive one, they do stick a little bit, so a little bit of flour really does the job. So make sure your biscuits are all the same thickness, the same size. You don't want little ones and big ones, because like I explained earlier, that wouldn't work. So you can see that's demonstrated there perfectly. That one there is a little bit too small. We want to try and make them the same size if we can. And then you bake, put them in the oven, and you need to keep watching. So what you're looking for is some even shaped, even thickness biscuits. Don't worry too much that these look like they've got a lot of flour on. Biscuits are supposed to crack or crunch or be a bit crumbly when you eat them. If they didn't have that flour in, that wouldn't happen. They'd be a bit gooey, unless you like a gooey biscuit, and in which case you need less flour than what I used. You will notice that on my oven, the little light's gone out. So if you've got an electric oven and the light's gone out, that means that your oven is up to temperature. So it's just gone back on again. Say that it keeps warming and your oven up to temperature, so we're at 180 degrees. For the thickness biscuit, I would recommend somewhere between 8 to 12 minutes, but you need to decide, like we said on the objectives. If you poke your biscuit halfway through, it's going to feel soft. If you poke your biscuit at the end of baking, it's going to feel soft. Biscuits don't harden until they cool down, so it's hard to judge. I'll let you be the judge of that. Decide how you want to do it, and hopefully they'll be really tasty. I'm going to put them in the oven now. I reckon, probably looking at the thickness of mine, about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to check them. Get your timer on. Happy days. So now your biscuits are in the oven. All you need to do is wash up all your equipment. On a hot day like this, I would recommend you probably leave your washing up on the draining board to air dry, and then use a tea towel. A, it means you don't have to wash your tea towel, it saves you on using your washing machine, and B, it's actually slightly more hygienic because you're not transferring any bacteria or germs that might be on your tea towel onto the clean equipment, and you can then put it away when it's all dry. So that's my alarm going off. I set a 10-minute timer because I wanted to check for 10 minutes. And here are my biscuits, cooking along nicely. As I said, middle shelf, nice. We don't want to burn them at the top. And they look pretty good, but as you can see, very careful. They're still very, very soft. A bit too soft for my liking, so I think you need another couple of minutes yet. The fact that they've got some cracks seems really nice. Creates another aesthetic. But don't leave your oven door open for too long. Otherwise what will happen is that all of that heat will escape. And as you can see, the lights come back on to say that it's not at a constant 180 degrees. So I've washed up all of my equipment. I have wiped down all of my surfaces. I've got my cooling racks ready because my biscuits are about to come out of the oven. So biscuits are out. I have put my baking tray on top of a cooling rack, so I do not want to put a hot tray on the work surface. As it's wood, it might burn. Should be okay, but just in case. And then you need to be very careful when you use your fish slice, just to scoop quickly and on. So I'll show you that again. Scoop and on. Scoop and on. And I know that they're probably a little bit more done than the first time I checked because they feel a little bit firmer, which is exactly what we need. So we had one biscuit crack, not a problem. What it does show is that it's cooked inside, which is great. But you can see, because they're still hot, be very careful touching it, they are soft because they're hot. As soon as they start to cool down, they're going to become crispy and firm up like a biscuit ready to dunk in your tea. So we had one biscuit crack, not a problem. What it does show is that it's cooked inside, which is great. But you can see, because they're still hot, be very careful touching it, they are soft because they're hot. As soon as they start to cool down, they're going to become crispy and firm up like a biscuit, ready to dunk in your tea. So now the biscuits have cooled down, you can see they have hardened, just like I said. There's the proof. They look yummy, they smell yummy, and they taste yummy. So take 5 answers. Baking powder is used in cakes, and it's used to increase the volume and lighten the texture of cakes. And yeast is used in bread, and what it does is it produces carbon dioxide bubbles, and those bubbles give your bread air, which makes it rise.